How can leaders maintain their values and purpose amid competing demands? Well, it is the question that quietly haunts nearly every school principal, assistant superintendent, and central office director I have ever had the privilege of sitting with. Not necessarily in the formal boardroom moments, but in the honest, unguarded conversations that happen in the parking lot after a long board meeting or over a cold cup of coffee at the end of a difficult week. And I have come to believe that this question is not a sign of weakness. It is actually the hallmark of a leader who still cares deeply about why they stepped into this work in the first place. So let me tell you about a moment I will never forget. Years ago, I was sitting across from a brilliant building principal, someone who had poured her life into her school community, who knew every child's name, who showed up early and left late, who believed in the power of education with every fiber of her being. But when I looked into her eyes that afternoon, I did not see the fire I had come to expect. I saw exhaustion. Worse, I saw a woman who had quietly begun to drift, making decisions based on what was urgent rather than what was right, saying yes when her gut and her values were screaming no. She had not abandoned her integrity. She had simply stopped protecting it. She said, "I don't even recognize some of my own choices anymore, Kim. I know who I am. I just can't seem to hold on to it." Well, that conversation changed the way I think about leadership identity forever. Here's what so many administrators get wrong. They treat their values like a destination, a place they arrived at once during some professional development retreat or graduate school seminar, rather than a living practice that must be tended to every single day. They assume that because they once had clarity about their purpose, that clarity will stay with them through the storms. But it will not. The reality of K-12 leadership, especially at the central office level, is that you are perpetually standing at the intersection of competing truths. You see, community members want one thing, central office administration wants another, staff morale pulls in a third direction. State mandates point to a fourth. And in the middle of all of that noise, your values can quietly be buried, not by a dramatic moment of compromise, but by 1,000 tiny accommodations made in the name of survival. James McGregor Burns, whose foundational work on transformational leadership remains as relevant today as ever. He argued that the most powerful leaders are those who elevate both themselves and those they lead toward higher moral purpose. But you cannot elevate anyone to a place you have not first anchored yourself. The drift begins almost always not with a moral failure, but with a presence failure. Leaders stop showing up fully to the internal conversation about who they are and what they stand for. So I know you're wondering, what does it actually look like to stay anchored? Well, first, it begins with understanding that your values are not self-sustaining. They require intentional cultivation. One of my favorite authors is Brene Brown. And in her research on courageous leadership, she makes the point clearly. Living into our values means we do not just profess them, we practice them. You see, there is a profound difference between a leader who posts their core values on the wall and one who integrates them into their own decisions against those values at the end of every week. The practice I have seen work most consistently for school leaders is what I call a values audit. It is not complicated. So before the week begins, write down the 2 or 3 things you are facing that feel like pressure points, the decisions that make you uncomfortable, the conversations you have been avoiding, and the ask that do not quite sit right. Then, hold each of them up against your stated values, like holding up a fabric swatch up to the light to see the colors. Where is the alignment? Where is the friction? That friction is not something to smooth over. That friction is data. Second, consider the power of your inner circle. Leadership isolation is one of the most dangerous forces in K-12 education. When we have no one in our lives who will tell us the truth, who will say, I notice you've been making decisions differently lately. Let's talk about that. We become vulnerable to the slow drift I described earlier. Patrick Lencioni, in his seminal work on organizational health, reminds us that building trust is the foundation upon which everything else in a healthy team is built. That is equally true in your personal leadership ecosystem. Surround yourself with people who love you enough to hold up a mirror. Third, and this is the piece that is most often missing in the conversation about leadership values. You must learn to distinguish between adapting and abandoning. You see, great leaders are flexible. They read the room. They adjust their approach based on context, culture, and the evolving needs of their communities. But adaptation is about your style. Abandonment is about your substance. You can change how you deliver a message without changing what you fundamentally believe. You can be responsive to community pressure without surrendering the principle that every child deserves equitable access to excellence. So, knowing the difference between those two things is one of the most sophisticated leadership skills, and it is rarely taught in administrator preparation programs. As Stephen Covey put it in a line that has stayed with me for years, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. For K-12 leaders, the main thing always is students. So when competing demands threaten to pull you off course, returning to that center point is not naive or idealistic. It is a disciplined act of leadership. So now what? Well, this week, before you respond to the next urgent email, before you say yes to the next committee, before you make the next decision that makes your stomach feel a little uncertain, pause. Pause and ask yourself 3 questions. Number 1, does this align with what I say I believe? The next question, would I be comfortable if my team could see every factor that went into this choice? And last but not least, and is this decision moving students closer to the future they deserve? If the answer to any of those questions gives you pause, that pause is not an obstacle. It is an invitation back to yourself, back to your purpose, and back to the kind of leadership that will outlast every competing demand that the calendar can throw at you. You did not step into this work to simply manage competing pressures. You stepped into it to lead. And leading, at its most essential, is always an act of identity. So guard yours, protect it, tend to it like the precious and irreplaceable thing it is. Because the children in your buildings are counting on the version of you that has not drifted. They are counting on the anchored leader.